In this video, we will turn our attention to church history and the different views about end times that Christians have held over the centuries. In the early church, there are a few things that can just be taken for granted. They're the things that everyone believed, and we would do well to believe in these as well. They are the biblical teachings about end times. First is the future literal return of Christ, then the resurrection of the dead. Now, this point is important because when false teachers began to come in and teach Gnosticism, Gnosticism taught that the body was inherently evil, not because of the fall, but because all material existence is evil. And so salvation for the Gnostics was freedom from the body. And so the resurrection of the dead was a very important doctrine for the early church to hold on to. Of course, the idea that there is a judgment day coming in the future for all people, that God would judge the quick and the dead, as the old saying goes. And because they faced suffering and persecution, their hope was in a future state and in the kingdom to come and not in this present world. Now, the first hints that we have at diversity on major ideas in eschatology come around the idea of millennialism, which is how do we understand this 1,000-year reign that John talked about in the Revelation? And so the earliest Christians seemed to take this literally. They were what we now call historic premillennialists. They believed that they lived in the time before the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now, this is different than dispensational premillennialism, which is much more popular today, and we'll talk about that later on. And it stayed this way until Augustine taught amillennialism in the 4th and 5th centuries. Augustine decided that the right way to understand this millennial reign is to think of it in terms of a spiritual reign, or a metaphor for his current reign over all the earth. And so amillennialism became the church's teaching throughout the Catholic world, and it was also the teaching of the Reformers. So it comes to us through the present day, through the Reformation, and specifically in Reformed thought. But that's not the only version of millennialism that happened even in the early church. So the triumph of the church over Rome gives rise to postmillennialism, which is the belief that we bring in the kingdom by establishing a millennial kingdom here on earth ourselves, and that Jesus will come after that. Now, what's really fascinating here is each view is tied to a different interpretation of history. It tends to be that if you see society on a downward trajectory, that is, if you see things getting worse, you tend to be premillennial and believe that things are headed toward the end and that only Christ's radical coming can bring the kingdom into this world. Amillennialism tends to believe that neither good nor evil will outpace each other. And so it tends to be in times of either stability or balanced good and evil that they interpret history as something that's a little more stable, not really on a downward trajectory, but that good and evil will live together until the end. That's going to lend itself to amillennialism. Now, postmillennialism tends to be the choice of people who are very optimistic about the way history is going. So especially when things are going very well, and especially when they're going well for the church, there's the tendency to think everything will get better on its own before Jesus comes back. Now, that's not to settle the matter, and obviously you could have different interpretations of history that don't match up with your view of the millennium, but they tend to go hand in hand. Turning to the medieval era, we see more evidence of people thinking about the end of history and when Christ will come back. And the first time this really happens with a vengeance is in the year 1000 AD, just like those of you who are old enough to remember experienced Y2K and the fears about the end of the world in the year 2000. People had the exact same set of fears around the year 1000 for the same reason. It's a very large, round number that seems significant. A few hundred years later, a monk named Joachim of Fiore came up with his own theory of history where he divided it into 3 periods, and he associated these with the persons of the Trinity. And so he saw the Old Testament as the age of the Father, and the present age as the age of the Son, ever since Jesus came until the present. And he theorized that they were on the verge of moving into the age of the Spirit, which is a very utopian view of the future. And this perspective on history ends up being very influential in centuries to come. And even though this monk was, for the most part, rejected in his own time by people like Aquinas, future generations would be much more interested in this idea and will find that it has a big impact in the modern age. Now, if we fast forward to the Reformation and Martin Luther, he sees the corruption in the Catholic Church as a sign of the end, much like a premillennial interpretation of history. He thinks that the end is near because the Catholic Church is going so badly. And so this plays into his idea that the Jews should be saved, and when they don't listen to the gospel, it plays into his racism against them. His anti-Semitism was rooted in his frustration that they would not believe in Jesus because he thought they were holding up God's plan in history. And so this idea that we have to do something in order to bring about the kingdom has its own consequences in Christian thought. Now, as we move into the modern period very slowly, we see after Luther the Anabaptists, who are part of the Radical Reformation. They are going to go further than Luther did. And one of the interesting things that they do is they try to establish the millennial kingdom on earth by force. And they actually take over the city of Munster and try to create utopia there. And it goes very badly. And they're very interesting stories. The history of that city and what happened there is fascinating and in some ways horrifying, especially as Christians, knowing the way that we ought to live and seeing what actually happened there. But again, this idea that we're trying to bring about the kingdom, that somehow Christ cannot come until we do something, begins to have more and more purchase in the popular consciousness. As theology becomes liberalized, as people walk away from a literal interpretation of Scripture, liberal theologians tend to keep the postmillennial framework because they see culture as getting better, as evolving toward a utopia. They're very hopeful about the direction of culture, but they stopped believing in the divinity of Christ, and so there became to be a secular version of postmillennialism, a very utopian view about the way history is going. And you see that partly in the works of Hegel, who believed that history was moving toward this utopian perfection. Now, there in the 19th century, we have John Nelson Darby, who is the spokesperson behind dispensational premillennialism. He was the first person to come up with the idea of the secret rapture as an explanation for some difficult texts in the New Testament, and he saw that that fit well with a dispensational reading of Scripture, which was premillennial, but also had different views about the church and Israel, about the tribulation, and about a future for Israel. So it's a very different system than the historic premillennialism, and it becomes very, very popular, especially in America and the English-speaking world. By the time that we get to the 20th century, the volatility of the world wars 1 and 2, and the use of the atomic bomb, the Great Depression, the Cold War, Civil Rights era, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, each of these things, one right after the other, all that volatility made people think that this time the end of the world really was here. The year 2000 was fast approaching, and the world seemed incredibly chaotic and crazy. And so this, combined with the popularity of premillennialism, turned into almost a very anxious age about end times and the fear of being left behind when God secretly steals away all the believers. And so the 20th century was a very anxious age, and it's yet to be seen whether the 21st century will be very different in that regard. The church still has not reached any kind of consensus about the millennial kingdom or whether we need to do something to bring Christ back. But it's important to recognize that our views of history and our views of politics are deeply wrapped up in our idea about end times and about the millennial kingdom especially. And so the more we can learn about that and come to an informed position on this doctrine, the better we'll be able to engage with the world and to understand the path that God has us on.